Global Compliance Panel's live webinar on purchasing and supply controls in the medical device industry. My name is Michael, and I'll be a host for today's session. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for being part of today's event. Today's webinar is being presented by Mr. Jeff Kassoff. Jeff, RAC, is the Director of Quality at Medivators, a leading manufacturer of endoscopy and colonoscopy products. In this position, Jeff is responsible for supplier management, during which he reviews and approves supplier qualification, selection, assessment, and CAPA. Prior to this, Jeff spent 13 years at LifeTech as the Director of Regulatory Affairs, where he was responsible for regulatory compliance of all aspects of the quality system. Jeff received his Regulatory Affairs certification in the year 1996. We are honored to have Mr. Kassoff with us to present today's session. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I just want to quickly outline today's program. This webinar is for a 60-minute duration. First, Jeff will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that he would cover, and then share with you his presentation. And also would like to inform all our participants that once part of the teleconference, you've been placed on mute and would remain so until the Q&A begins towards the end of the webinar. This is again just to ensure that there is no discontinuity, and also this ensures that most of you could take maximum benefit from today's session. And also, we request you all to hold your questions back. We have over 10 minutes of time at the end of the session for the Q&A. But if you do think of questions during the session, you could post them in the Q&A panel on your participant screen, and we can come back to it at the end of the session. And for any reason, ladies and gentlemen, if you do get logged out of today's session, please follow the same procedure to join in again. Now that we're all set, I do request Jeff to take it from here. Jeff?
Thanks so much for the introduction. Usually I begin this webinar by welcoming everybody and letting you know that for those of you who have not attended webinars before, the only detriment is that we can't see each other, and I do address my Q&A portion of the presentation and more of a discussion, if you'd like. There's something else down here in the Houston area. It's raining torrentially, and there's a chance that everything might shut down here, so I may be cut off. If so, just want to ask your patience, and I'll call back in, and everything should be up and running. Another thing is that while we have an hour budgeted for this, you know, it's 12:05 already, one of my passions is in the regulatory and quality area is working with suppliers. I really enjoy the challenges of communicating to suppliers, getting them to work with you. To me, it ends up being almost like a familial type of relationship when you're done, when you have good suppliers upon whom you can rely and to provide you with quality product in a timely manner, and very importantly, inform you in advance when there's going to be any deviation from that. I like to organize this particular presentation by beginning with regulatory requirements. I really feel like it's important before you can understand what you need to do to try to explain, for me to explain to you what the regulations say. Sometimes with regard to some areas, specifically supplier management, there's a couple of misunderstandings. Section 2 will be the key elements of the supplier qualification program. Two areas to supplier management. The first is qualification, getting the supplier on board, making sure that you've reviewed them to see what kind of company they are even before you order anything from them. The second section is the supplier management, the ongoing supplier assessment. Third section is the concept of the quality agreement. That's a document that I'll spend a little while talking about that's used between two companies to really explain expectations. And then we'll continue on with supplier assessment, which is the ongoing periodic monitoring of your suppliers. And then supplier nonconformance. There are going to be times where your supplier does not conform with your expectations, and there are different types of nonconformances and different ways to handle those. Then I like to provide a section of required documentation. This is really a summary, if you will, of the documentation that's provided for each of the areas: qualification, assessment, nonconformance, so on. And then we'll tie it all together in a nice, neat bow. I'll provide you with the summary, which should pull everything together, and then we'll have the Q&A or discussion section. The first section, as I said, is regulatory requirements, and I feel like it's usually important to understand where you are by understanding how you got there. So from a domestic perspective, in the early version of the quality system regs, the GMPs, the good manufacturing practices, you can usually tell how long someone's been in the industry by what they refer to the regulations as. Back from the 76 to 83, there was really no requirement, but I can tell you that there were times where your management of your suppliers was reviewed during the inspection. Back then, the whole inspection process was very haphazard. It jumped around a lot. There was no QSIT, Quality Systems Inspection Technique, which is the guidance document by which the agency inspects us now. So supplier management was on the table just like anything else was. In 83, the drafters figured out that they wanted to be able to let industry understand what was better expected of them, and they introduced 82050A, which is evaluation of suppliers, contractors, and consultants. Conversely, the ISO standard 13485, even in its 1996 version, it did have a clause titled assessment of subcontractors. And when they amended it to the 2003 version, they renumbered much of it. They added some things. But with regard to supplier management, 741 really mimicked 462 very closely, but they added an explicit reference to outsourced processes in section in 4.1. There is actually a guidance document titled Guidance on Outsourced Processes, and what it does is it explains what your notified body and other international regulatory agencies consider to be outsourced processes, and it gives you some ideas on how to handle those specific types of processes. Internally, from a requirement perspective, 82050, and as you'll see here, it's very seldom that I will just type put the entirety of the regs in a slide. I don't feel like that does anybody any favors. You can read the regs yourself. So I highlight the sections. And what I want to talk about in 82050 under purchasing controls is that it includes all products and services. So already we see that it's not just the components you get product, it's the services that you are provided, any OEM relationship, any distribution, any subcontract manufacturing, consulting, those are all services. In 82050A, which is evaluation of suppliers, contractors, and consultants, what the interesting phrase the reg has is it requires you to establish and maintain the requirements, including quality requirements that must be met by suppliers, contractors, and consultants. Interesting choice of terms here. Remember that the drafters of the regulations take painstaking measures to make sure that the words they choose mean something. The phrase including quality requirements wasn't just thrown in there as, oh wait, we want to make sure that we explicitly refer to that there are quality requirements. But what this phrase says is that there are requirements other than quality requirements that your suppliers, contractors, and consultants have to meet. So there are requirements other than those that deal only with component acceptance. So right away we're opening our eyes, the regs are opening our eyes to say there are other things we have to do to manage our suppliers to make sure we get safe and effective product. What we're required to do is we've got to evaluate and select potential suppliers, contractors, and consultants, there's the big three as always, on the basis of their ability to meet specified requirements, here comes the phrase again, including quality requirements. And you have to document your evaluation, of course you do. A couple of interesting things in this. Sort of going back to front, the including requirements phrase is repeated here. And again, it's reminding us that there are requirements other than quality requirements. And we'll obviously spend a great deal of this presentation covering those things. But something else is interesting here, that you're required to evaluate and select your potential suppliers. Not just select the potential suppliers on their basis of their ability to meet some requirements, but evaluate and select. So what this implies is that there are two distinct processes here, the evaluation process and the selection process. What this, an interpretation of this can lead us to believe that there's going to be some potential suppliers. Look at the word here, potential suppliers. So a potential supplier is a supplier that you may or may not utilize. So you're going to be evaluating potential suppliers, which suggests that there are some potential suppliers who you evaluate and you do not select. Well, the question can be asked, how can I show compliance with this section of the reg? And the answer is by showing that you evaluate suppliers who you ultimately do not use. So you have companies that you have a particular component that you want, and you have 3 potential suppliers, and you evaluate them all and you select one, or sometimes 2. Many firms have backup or secondary suppliers. So to be able to show the agency that you comply with this regulation in your supplier files, you're going to have to maintain evaluation documentation of suppliers who you ended up not using. They remained potential suppliers. From a practical standpoint, that actually does help, because if perhaps one of the reasons you may not choose one of your 3 surveyed suppliers is because one costs too much. Well, sure, we all want to save money, but sometimes what you find is when something's too good, when something appears to be too good to be true, it often is too good to be true. If we were facing each other, I'd ask to see a show of hands for how many times you evaluated a supplier, used the supplier, and found that that supplier was, for the most part, unable to on an ongoing basis, provide you with quality products. And I'm sure I would see some hands, because sometimes the cost is built in to the product. Sometimes the companies that charge a little more do give better product. So when you evaluate a potential supplier and decide not to use them for cost reasons, if you later decide to use them, you have already evaluated them. You can immediately move to moving them to your approved supplier list and using them as a supplier. Something else we're required to do is define the type and extent of control to be exercised over the product and services and suppliers, et cetera, based on the evaluation results. Well, the type and extent of control to be exercised over product is in your component specifications. That explains how your frequency of inspection, your sample size, unless that's elsewhere. But even if it is elsewhere, you have defined the type and extent of control to be exercised over that product. But now what we're looking at is the type and extent of control to be exercised over services, suppliers, contractors, and consultants based on the evaluation results. Practically speaking, what happens is your evaluation shows that your supplier is an acceptable supplier, and you determine what type of control you're going to exercise over them because they are an acceptable supplier. Most firms have the overwhelming majority of their suppliers into one pile, and the type and extent of control they exercise over them is, off the top of my head, that they're going to assess their suppliers per their supplier assessment procedure on an ongoing basis twice a year, and they're going to report that to their quality review board or CAPA committee, what have you. There are other firms that define the type and extent not just based on the evaluation results, but additionally based on the criticality of the component. If I have a supplier who's providing me with an off-the-shelf, perhaps a shipping box or a packaging box, a chipboard carton into which 10 of my finished devices go, but I have another supplier who's providing me with a blood contact component, I may decide to have the type and extent of control over the critical supplier of the more critical component to be a little more in depth than over the chipboard carton. But you at least have to base it on the evaluation results. And the best way to do that is to just document in your procedure, here's the type and extent of control we subject our suppliers to. You have to establish and maintain records of acceptable suppliers, contractors, and consultants. You have to both establish the records and you have to maintain the records. So in your procedure, it will explain it will state what types of records you need to maintain for your suppliers, contractors, and consultants. And just as an aside here, a note on the bottom here, you can have different types of records, or you can establish different types of record-keeping requirements for suppliers versus subcontractors versus consultants. That's entirely up to you. So you're not tied to establishing one type of records for the pile of those, but you can establish the type for one or each of those separately. Internationally, it's very risk-based. It's product realization-based. The type of control you apply to the supplier depends upon the effect of the product you purchase from them on your product realization, which is your product actualization process, or the final product. So there's a bit of evaluation here, which is more than just supplier-based. There's a bit of purchase product-based, which, as I mentioned earlier, some firms choose to do that, even those who do not sell internationally. They evaluate the supplier based on the component that they're going to provide them, and then define the type and extent of control based on that component. And obviously, the second bullet point is very familiar because it's virtually identical to the first area, in which you're going to select suppliers based on their ability to supply products in accordance with your requirements. So you set forth your requirements. We're not going to use a supplier unless we have shown them what our component acceptance criteria is, and then make sure they can meet that. And you've got to establish criteria for selection, evaluation, and reevaluation. The distinction between evaluation and reevaluation is that when you evaluate your suppliers, you may determine that a particular supplier does not meet your ongoing acceptance criteria. Perhaps you're going to rate your suppliers and they need to be at 80%. Well, if you have a supplier that fails to meet that, you're going to need to reevaluate them. And obviously, you have to document all of your results. And this is in both ISO 13485 and ISO 9001. Clause 741 is purchasing. It's identical in both standards. The differences, to summarize here, are you've got to establish, maintain records of your suppliers in the domestic QSR. Just as an aside, I've seen it done two ways. More often than not, people have an AVL-approved, vendor-approved supplier list. I have seen particularly smaller companies handle it in a slightly different way. On each of their component specifications, they have a primary and or secondary supplier. And those are the only suppliers from whom that firm may purchase those components. And when a supplier falls off the approved supplier list, the list that's not written, but sort of the virtual list, if you will, they do an ECO or ECN, a document change, to that component specification. I've seen it done both ways. As I said, I prefer the list, obviously. The quality system reg also requires you to try to get an agreement from suppliers in which they're going to tell you about any changes to the product they supply you, or any changes to the processes involved with the product they supply you before the changes are implemented. This is the only regulation with which I'm familiar that requires a regulated industry to try to do something, because more often than not, I don't want to say that, there are going to be very few times where you don't get that. Either the supplier just doesn't agree to do that, or the supplier neglects to do that when necessary. It's more difficult, obviously, to get this type of agreement from a larger firm or a larger supplier if you're a smaller company. If you purchase electronic components, capacitors, resistors, for example, and you purchase them for a domestic distributor of an Asian company, you're not going to get this agreement in writing. I like to try to limit this, and we'll talk in a few minutes about the quality agreement, for suppliers of my more critical components. Internationally, as I said earlier, it's very risk-based, it's very product realization-based. So it's a little different, but this is a good practice to do anyway, even if you don't sell internationally. The key elements of the supplier qualification program begin with explanation of some terminology. Then we'll identify the types of suppliers. We'll take a look at whether there is actually a need for qualification, and if so, what type. We'll look at the steps of the qualification process, cover supplier selection a little, and while not explicitly listed in the elements I will define, something we always need to remember is that our supplier assessment process, supplier qualification process, should always be as cost efficient as possible. And I'll go into some detail at least several times during the presentation. There are many key terms that we use in supplier management that are not defined in the regulations. You want to make sure that you document these in your procedures, so that, forgetting the agency for a moment, just so that your people internally are clear about what they mean. Approved versus unapproved. You see that a lot. Well, this is an approved supplier. If they're approved, then they're documented on your approved supplier list or in your component specifications, however you do that. I've often heard the term preferred supplier, and that's a reasonable one. Many firms have, for a particular component, they will have a primary and a secondary supplier. So the primary supplier is probably the preferred supplier. I like to consider that kind of an implied concept. I don't want to necessarily define that in my procedure, because then I may have to show examples of where I do that, where I have that. I might want to mention in my procedure the concept of primary and secondary suppliers, though. Some other terms I've heard thrown about there, I've heard of qualified suppliers. I guess that means approved suppliers. I've also heard the term certified suppliers. You don't hear that too often, luckily. And I don't know what that means. I recommend you don't use that terminology. There's no need to actually send each of your suppliers a certificate that certifies that they are your supplier, I guess. I'm not exactly sure, but stick with approved and unapproved in your procedure, and then the concept of preferred in practice. In identifying the types of suppliers, the question you've got to ask yourself is, what are the things that you get from a supplier? And there are several different types of things. The first one is a component, and that's something that is a part that is intended to be included in the finished device. A connector for a sterile consumable, even something as small as, again, as resistors or capacitors in an instrument type of thing. So you design your product so that this component will remain in it for its lifetime. Conversely, showing edge right there. Conversely, there's something called a manufacturing material. And this is something that is used in the process or produced during the process that's not by design or intent to be in there, but it is in there. Solder paste is a good example. We don't really intend, when we hand solder, for the paste to remain. We don't design it in there, but it's in there. We need to use it to facilitate the manufacturing process. Cyclohexanone is another good example. Cyclohexanone is used as an adhesive to adjoin plastic components. For the most part, cyclohexanone ends up evaporating, but there's still residual amounts there. That's a good manufacturing material. I don't design my product to make sure that I have remnants of cyclohexanone on it, but I do. Other things we get from a supplier, depending on whether you're speaking domestically or internationally, are something we get from a subcontractor or a service provider. These terms aren't defined, so I want to make sure that when you reference these or utilize these in your procedures and practices, you make sure to include all of your service providers or contractors that you can. There are some that are obvious. Sterilization, if you have a sterile product that you send out, that's obviously a contractor. Calibration, if you don't calibrate in-house, well, even if you do, you have standards that you're going to send out. But for things that you send out for calibration, you have a calibration service provider. Less obvious, some things people overlook from time to time are any outsourced functions, like outsourced design assistance or outsourced assembly. If you have a company who assembles some products for you, they have your name on them, but you outsource the assembly of those simple products. Those are considered service providers. When I say even less obvious, what I mean is that in all my years of spearheading the quality efforts for departments that sell internationally and therefore undergo notified body inspection for ISO and CE compliance. I've had many different auditors who come to audit me. I had one auditor once who in her evaluation of my supply management process, asked me to what extent I qualified our document storage provider. I'm not going to, there are firms out there, and I'm not doing a commercial though, a prevalent one of which is called Iron Mountain, where you package your documents, you send them to them, and they retain those documents for as long as you want them to. That is certainly a service that we are provided. So I had not qualified my document storage provider. As I said, I've had dozens of notified body inspectors and only one who ever asked me for it. But I feel like part of the value of these webinars and in-person seminars as well is those of us who have been around for a while sharing some of our experiences with those of you who may not have been around quite so long. And this is something that doesn't take very long to qualify your document storage provider, so just do it. The question is, how far is too far, with regard to consultants? Well, fortunately, instead of answering the question of, is it too far, what I like to do is focus on the fact that we do this already. When you hire a consultant, you don't just hire them. You look at their CV, their resume. You may call people who they've worked for in the past. You are, by gathering that intelligence and doing your due diligence, you are actually qualifying that supplier. So when you maintain a file with Jeff Kassoff, who's not a consultant, but someone who is a consultant, you have their CV in a file. You have qualified them already. So if it ever gets to the point during a notified body audit or FDA inspection, more likely a notified body audit, they tend to sort of go outside the box a little more. You've done this already, so you can certainly state that. There are two types of qualifications, and in determining the need for which type you use, you want to look at a couple of things. One is the significance of the item or service provided. You have a choice. You can use a paper qualification or a personal qualification. A paper one is, as we'll see in a moment, is document-based. A personal one is when you go on site. Since part of supplier management is making sure we're cost efficient, you want to reserve your personal qualifications to those situations where either the significance of the item or service provided is very high. If you have, for example, a Class 3 device that you manufacture, a significant part of which is outside manufactured for you, might be a good example of when you want to do a personal type of qualification. On the other hand, if you manufacture convenience kits, and what the company does outside for you is they take the kits, they open the drape, they drop the components in the drape, they wrap up the drape, and they place it in the kit. Maybe it's it's a non-sterile kit for the purposes of this example. I don't know that you actually need to go visit that facility. Sterilization, what I like to do, the rule of thumb I use is I go to visit my sterilizer every other year. And on the off year, I do a paper assessment. Of course, when I first used them, I went to qualify them just to see what the facility looked like. Something else is the impact of the item or service upon the product. And do a quick risk assessment kind of in your head. You want to look at if the item or service fails, service being an assembly, for example, what's the effect on the product? Does it completely not work? Does it maybe produce some kind of horrible false negative or something like that? And what's the impact on the patient if the item or service fails also? And how likely is it? In some cases, you may not be able to answer the second part of this question because you may not have any experience in this area. But if you have similar devices, and maybe, for example, you're looking for a new supplier for an existing component, you know what the likelihood of the failure is based on your experience. So you can use that intelligence to determine what type of qualification you need to do. The first step of the qualification process is to identify the potential supplier. don't think that this is just going to be a purchasing area, or there are some other firms, usually engineers, think, well, you know what, we don't need to involve purchasing right away. We just want to make sure that the potential supplier can actually do what we need them to do or provide the component that we need them to provide. It's better off doing it as a cross-functional team. You're better off having a purchasing, an R&D, or engineering, what have you, sit down and try to identify capabilities and then by cost or delivery implications. If you have what I'll call a specialty product, some people call it a custom product, which is something that is not off the shelf. It's something that this potential supplier is going to make for your company. It's not something they normally make. You're going to use a supplier qualification survey. And the first question, it says first and second, but it's really one simultaneous question. You want to find out whether that potential supplier is FDA or Health Canada registered, and actually more importantly, do they have any sort of ISO certification? 9001 for their quality system, 17025 if they're a calibration firm, 1345 if maybe they're a device manufacturer. If they are any of these, request a copy. The next point says that the certified body must be reputable. And I've been around long enough to remember situations where when the whole notified body aspect came into being, it was more of really a fad than anything else. So there were plenty of firms that tried to make it as certified bodies but failed. So we want to make sure that you can, if they have a website, they're going to be reputable. And when you look at the certification, the ISO certification, for example, make sure that you note the expiration date, especially if you end up using this potential supplier, and request a renewal upon expiration. That's going to be up to you. There have been several internal or external or customer audits in which I've been involved where our supplier management system was looked at and we had isolated occurrences of ISO certificates that were not current. We certainly got them current during the audit. Suppliers are more than happy to send them to you. Some, as a matter of fact, retain them on their websites. But you'd rather do this proactively than reactively. The way we handle it, the way I handle it is if this company is ISO certified, then I approve them immediately. Here's why. So my choices are paper or personal. So if I choose personal, what am I going to do? I'm going to go to a firm. I'm going to be there for maybe a whole day. That's a long time. Most of a day, let's just say a whole day, okay? And I'm going to look at their I'm going to look at whatever I can during the course of that day. But if they're ISO certified, they have a notified body. The notified body comes there a week or, well, let's say at least a week each year. And many firms who are ISO certified have been certified for over the course of several years. Every third year during your ISO certification, there's a research audit during which the notified body spends a little longer at your firm and looks at every possible system. So am I really going to be able to do all that in one day and make a determination? No, I'm not. So if a company is ISO certified, I consider them approved. However, you're going to have some potential suppliers that are not ISO certified. It happens. Luckily, the trend is more towards ISO certification, but some mom and pop shops, you know, maybe they're going to do some anodization for you, some machine work, something like that. There's a reasonable chance that they're not ISO certified. So if they're not, you're going to ask them to complete the remainder of the supplier qualification survey. This is very in-depth because if you go this route, your goal is to have enough documentation at your disposal for you to enable you to draw a conclusion that this supplier is ideally good for you. So you're going to ask for the organizational specifics, maybe they have an org chart, any site information. You're going to ask about their quality program. Do they have a quality manual? To what extent do they train? Do they have inspection procedures? Do they perform any incoming inspection on components they get? And if so, at what rate? How are they documented, and how is the status documented? You're going to want to take a look at what type of calibration or maintenance they perform on their inspection, test or inspection equipment, or their assembly equipment, or anything they have. And do they perform any internal audits? Now, you'll see, even looking at these 6 items, that some of them are quite industry specific, the medical device industry, and others not quite so much. Wherever you work, if you measure something with a hand tool, that hand tool better be calibrated. But you're not going to perform internal audits. So just because a firm answers no to any of these questions does not necessarily exclude them from consideration. Your goal is to get as accurate a compliance picture, not a compliance picture, as accurate a picture as possible of this potential supplier to enable you to draw a good conclusion. So some of these things may be deal killers. I can tell you that I'm not sure that I want to use a supplier who does not perform incoming inspection on the components that they receive. Because what's going to happen is, even if they have great components, there are going to be times where they fail. So when they give me a 4-week lead time, but they don't perform incoming inspection, but they don't inspect maybe till the very end where they perform the test, at 3.5 weeks, I get a call, and I'm told that, well, the 50 instruments they were going to send me aren't good because they failed this test and they troubleshot and found that this component was bad across all of them. So from a business perspective, I don't know that I would want to use a supplier that performed no incoming inspection for that business type reason. Remember that even though we're in quality, regulatory, what have you, perhaps some of you might be in purchasing, our primary responsibility is business related. It's to the company. And the double-edged sword being, well, if the FDA comes and shuts us down, it doesn't matter how much money we save. On the other hand, if we're not cost efficient, we're not going to be in business. So be aware from a compliance perspective that there are non-compliance related areas that we've got to understand and try to implement from under our compliance umbrella. Continuing the survey, returns or complaints. Does this firm get items back? Does this firm have items returned to them? And if so, how do they segregate them from good components? And do they have any corrective action they take? What type of procurement control, purchasing that is? What type of production qualification? Again, not a deal killer, but if you can have a firm that does some type of maybe validation light type of thing, how do they know that the product's there when they change an assembly process? How do they know it's going to work? What made them change it? Just because they saved some money? I want to make sure that works as well. In-process inspection, much like incoming inspection, a good business metric to be sure that if you have a firm that does an incoming inspection, an in-process inspection, and a final inspection test, you will always know early on when there's going to be a delay in delivery. What type of finished product handling or labeling or shipping or records do they maintain just from a traceability standpoint? You want to make sure that they're well organized. That's a lot of the supplier qualification. What type of design and document control do they have? If they make products for you, even if it's a small anodizing firm, they must have a process. They don't only anodize one item. So any item that's anodized is done for a different duration or using a different amount of material. So there's going to have to be some document type of controls that are there, even if they're just things that are on a table that people change. That's some type of control. At the end of this entire survey, your firm is going to perform a review and a supplier rating. We're going to review it and document your supplier rating. Either acceptable, which means go for it, conditionally acceptable. I like to use this for off-the-shelf product. There are going to be times where I send out a supplier qualification survey and they just can't fill it out. They're not the manufacturer, so either they can't or won't fill it out. And if it's for an off-the-shelf product that they make for me and 55 other customers, I'm okay with considering them conditionally acceptable. And then there's this unacceptable. I urge you to maintain all of your supplier qualification surveys that you determine to be unacceptable, because that will show, if for no other reason than to illustrate to the regulatory agencies that you're doing your job, that you're not just qualifying every supplier that you evaluate. Off-the-shelf product, as I mentioned earlier, present a very particular challenge. Whether it's a distributor, domestic distributor of international product, or whether it's an internet supplier, there are plenty of things you can buy over the internet, some of which can go into medical devices. I like to conditionally approve these suppliers and certainly document that from a quality perspective, and also make sure purchasing documents that, because purchasing is going to be, I don't want to say the babysitter, but they deal with them on an ongoing basis. And you limit this for a 6-month period, what I recommend. And if you've gotten at least one shipment and you've received no non-conforming product, you can say that this shows that they can provide you quality product, and you can move them from conditional approval to approval. And there are qualification mechanisms, because I like to have qualification mechanisms on my AVL, my approved vendor list, either ISO certified. In this particular case, you would call it proof of shipment. We've gotten product, so they're approved now because of proof of shipment. And it enables you to maintain a good history of your suppliers as well. Consultants have to have proven expertise in a particular area. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to hire a consultant who doesn't. So when I have their resume, have their CV, I'm going to retain that, and therefore they're qualified. I mentioned earlier, so you have a firm that can't or won't complete the supplier qualification survey. And the answer is sure. The conditional approval for firms that can't or won't, I like to have 12 months, as distinguished from firms who maybe completion of the survey, they don't complete it completely. Well, I didn't mean to say that. They don't fill it in completely. Some of the blanks are empty, or, you know what, they didn't really fill in a lot of things, but from a cost perspective, they seem reasonable. So I'm going to use proof of shipment, as I said earlier. You give these guys a 12-month conditional approval, again, documented by purchasing and QA, and at the end of a 12-month period, a little longer, because you have no information on the supplier qualification survey, you're going to review their status, and if everything's good, you can update their rating to an approved status. When it comes to selection, make sure you maintain your list or in your components. The next 3 points deal with a more historical concept than a more current one. Back in the day, there was the concept of implementing what was called grandfathered suppliers. I'm sorry, this is just the two points at the end. And these suppliers are ones that you had used prior to implementation of the actual regs themselves. I'm not that old, but when I came into the industry, I did see some suppliers that had been grandfathered. And what that meant was that prior to the FDA bringing in 1983, implementing the supplier management regulations, firms had used suppliers already. So the agency enabled them to grandfather these suppliers by proving that they used this supplier prior to implementation of the regs, and also that the component that they received from the supplier at that time was the same design of component. And that's where a lot of firms historically fell down, that they couldn't show that it was the same design, so they were required to get their suppliers qualified again. But in your list of approved suppliers, moving up to the second bullet point here, include the date of selection and the method of selection, certification, survey, proof of shipment, and again, there's the grandfather thing that probably remove this from any subsequent versions of this presentation, but definitely serves as a point of historical interest at the very least. The quality agreement is an agreement in contract form that's signed by both parties, but it's not a binding contract. I like to reserve this for my suppliers of more of my critical products or services. And it's really just a communication tool. It sets forth the requirements of both parties. It lets my supplier know what I need them to do, and it clarifies the expectations. It lets my supplier tell me what they expect from me, and vice versa as well. There are several, what I've done in this portion of the presentation is brought in sections of the quality agreement that you should feel free to use in drafting your own quality agreement if you want. The first section is the stated intent, and there it is, sort of a summary. The second part is a statement of authority. You want to make sure that the person signing for your supplier, and they want to make sure that the person signing for you has the authority to make commitments. You'll see later on that from a supplier's perspective, some of the things are shipment method. Well, I don't want somebody who does not have the authority to commit to a particular shipment method to try to make that commitment. When you look at training requirements, what tasks do I want the supplier's personnel to be trained on? And it can be a generic section such as anything regarding the assembly of this product or whatever you want to put in there. You want to explicitly require, again, communicating your expectations, that the documentation of this training be available upon request. What I like to do is even take it a step further to let my supplier know I'm just not going to randomly request this, but if I have a internal or usually an external audit or a customer audit and they want this documentation, I want you to know that I'm going to be asking for it. You want the supplier to let you know, to report to you any serious negative change to regulatory status in as timely a manner as possible. Have they been issued a warning letter if they're a device company or something like that?